Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. And in today's tutorial, we will be covering the brain. Now, there's many ways to learn how to draw the brain, but in this particular tutorial, we'll be learning how to draw the brain in a cross-section. This is going to provide us also with a really great opportunity to understand how to place different features together. It'll also give us a sense of scale of different features and how they compare to one another. So with that being said, let's get started. Now, the way in which we can start this tutorial is with a generalized vague sketch with our pencils, where we actually just start demarcating an area in which we will be drawing the brain on the page. Now, the idea is that when we deal with complex subject matter, such as the brain that is comprised of all these various components and features placed together, what you want to do is you really want to start lightly, and you really want to slowly build up the sketch very lightly, and this way you can utilize your eraser in tandem with your pencil as you slowly start to form the brain. Now, a really good suggestion would be that we actually start forming a general outline of the brain once we have established how large we will actually be drawing the brain, and this is basically going to help us slowly develop the outer top outline that kind of slowly establishes the curvy organ-like structure, which is the various lobes of the brain. Now, the brain is obviously comprised of different lobes. So the brain has a frontal lobe, a limbic lobe, a parietal lobe, and an occipital lobe. And these lobes have this very organ-like composition that almost seems as if it's folding in on itself. So what we want to do is we basically want to establish the curvy exterior outline of these lobes that forms along the top section of the brain, or forms the top outline of the brain. Again, we just want to basically work quite vaguely at this point. Now, as we continue with this process of lightly sketching in the outline that establishes the lobes, we want to start bringing that curvature from the frontal lobe into the inner features, where we can actually start drawing in features such as corpus callosum, the thalamus, the optic chiasma, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and so on and so on. And again, we really want to just keep our sketch lights. A really good suggestion would obviously be to look at a cross section of a brain and keep one nearby, maybe on your phone or on a digital device, or even print it out just to assist you as you draw in these features. Now, the thing is, what we're doing here is we really just want to work out these features very lightly with our pencil, and we'll find that we should be taking our time with this process, this early process, working back and forth with our pencil and our eraser, slowly working in these features. We just want to make sure that the scale between these inner features, such as the corpus callosum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and so on, and the outer lobe features makes sense in relation to each other and how they fit together. So it's really important to remember that the lobes are the organ-like structure that kind of covers the top section of the brain, or forms the top section of the brain, and will obviously protect and cover the inner details and components of the brain. As we continue with this light sketch of the brain, we will find that there are these branch-like, or kind of like a tree branch structure that connects into the brain, and this is where we can start to see the pons, or how the small little components such as the pituitary gland flows into the pons of the brain, as well as the medulla oblongata, and then eventually the spinal cord. And this spinal cord kind of flows down the bottom section of the brain and connects into the middle area of the brain, where all these inner features start to connect together. Now, the intention during this process of really working with a light sketch, slowly defining all the different features, just trying to get a generalized idea of placement and scale, is, we really want to make sure that our pencil marks are really light at this point, because at some points, once we have made a more refined sketch, we'll move on to more contrasted detail to give more three-dimensionality and structure to the brain drawing. But for now, we just want to focus on placement. We want to understand how these different components fit together. A really good suggestion is also to consider with each feature that you draw how large they are in relation to the next feature that is placed kind of next to it or nearby the last feature you have drawn. So basically what we are doing is we're utilizing all the different features we draw as a measurement or a scale to assist us in drawing the next feature and determining how large that next feature should be. Now again, the spinal cord obviously flows into the medulla oblongata as well as the pons and eventually the pituitary gland, but we'll start to see that as we draw these features, they all kind of connect to one another. So really just take your time working with your eraser and your pencil, slowly forming these details and basically assembling them as if you were Lego blocks. Now, when we come to the back end of the brain, this is where we start seeing the occipital lobe, which is placed on top of the cerebellum. And then we also get this branch-like structure that kind of stems from the pineal gland, and basically this cross-section is kind of defining the inner section of the cerebellum, which slowly also reveals how the cerebellum has these aqueducts, and these are actually called the cerebral aqueducts, which kind of are like branch structures that connect to the pineal gland and flow from the pineal gland all the way around or curving around the thalamus area of the brain. So again, this is a time where we really want to make sure we go slowly, be patient. We really want to also look at a diagram of a brain in order to understand scale a little bit better, as well as positioning of different components. So it's really important that you take your time working with a light pencil, slowly establishing the sketch. It's okay if you go back and forth with your eraser and your pencil, because it should take some time in order to establish a light placement of these features. Some features to really pay attention to in order to establish the very unique composition and textural quality is the lobes, the various lobes. And again, obviously, these lobes in a cross-section seem as if they are squished organs. But if we really look at them and pay attention to what we're actually seeing, what we are seeing is just an array of lines that kind of are strategically or very uniquely placed together that defines or kind of creates this effect, this visual effect of like squished up organs. So starting from one side of the brain, potentially maybe the back end, the occipital lobe area, and slowly working around the brain, we can start to actually draw in these lines. And these lines are going to slowly establish the thick organ-like structure as if they are squished and compiled closely together, forming around the top section of the brain, as well as curving around the inner section or the inner features of the brain as if it is encasing the inner sections of the brain. Now again, this is a matter of being patient. This is purely a time where we work with both our eraser and pencil, lightly placing the features, making sure that everything is fit well together, that they are accurate in scale compared to one another. And once we have done this, we can slowly transition into working with a darker pencil where we can start refining these details and adding a little bit more three-dimensionality. Now, at this point, what we should have is a generalized sketch of a brain, and something that obviously has a correct and accurate placement of features. The scale of the variety of features should be correct at this point. And this is where we can start transitioning into adding some shading marks in order to refine these details and bring some more structure and detail to the brain drawing. Now, this time we're going to start from the spinal cord, and what we're going to do is we're going to slowly start shading in features, slowly working from the spinal cord, working our way up into the center features of the brain, and then slowly working around the lobes of the brain, which will come to last. Now, again, the idea here is to utilize our shading to emphasize these structures. So when we think about the spinal cord, we really want to think about it as this cylindrical tube that runs into the center area of the brain as it connects to the variety of features placed within the central area. So obviously the way in which we can define this curved tube-like structure is we want to start adding some gradients of shading from the edges, slowly shifting into the center surface area of that tube. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're creating these little gradients of shading. This is going to be a common thing that we do throughout this entire brain drawing, because as we create gradients of shadow or shading rather, that's slowly going to create this three-dimensional effect, making the different features stand out a little more and seem less flat within the drawing. So slowly working from the spinal cord, we can start shading along the edges or the outer lines of the spinal cord and slowly creating these gradients that shift from dark to light into the central area of the spinal cord. And this process we can continue as we slowly shift into the features within the central area of the brain. So again, we really want to consider these different features, and this is why it's good to have a diagram nearby as we continue with our drawing, because we really want to consider how they protrude as well as have a variety of different textures. Now, when we start thinking about the pons or the spinal cord or the pituitary gland or the various lobes, all these different features have different textural qualities, and the way in which we're going to represent the actual surface area or the actual texture in these various features is by the utilization of shading. Now, obviously, a cross-section is giving us a look inside these different features, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are flat. So we do also want to consider that all of these various features are actual three-dimensional structures, and the way in which we can emphasize their three-dimensionality is by focusing on each little feature one by one, slowly making some use of shading to give more emphasis to their form. So for instance, as we move through the pons, we can start shading in the little ridges that are definitive of the structure of the pons. Or for instance, as we continue, we start to add some shading along the rounded outline of the two circular structures that is the pituitary gland. And this is kind of the mentality we want to have with each of these features. Adding some shading, obviously, when we're dealing with a cross-section of a brain, it's not necessarily drawing an actual three-dimensional structure from the outside. That is a different of a visual quality of the brain. But in this cross-section, what we do want to do is we just want to give more detail to these various features, and the way in which we can do this is create these various gradients or ridges or line work depending on the actual textural quality of the feature. We want to consider that and then obviously implement the necessary detailing or shading or line work just to emphasize these forms better. Now, as we start shifting from the central area to the features placed near the backside of the brain, such as the cerebellum or the cerebral aqueducts, where we can actually see the cross-section of the branch-like structures in the cerebellum, we really want to start considering using something like pen, where we can actually darken those branch-like structures and give a little bit more of a distinct outline to them. Now, again, it's really important for us to be really conscious of the textural variety within these various features as we proceed to add in some line work and shading. And we really want to think about how we can enhance these features by utilizing these drawing techniques and skills. So, for instance, the cerebellum or the outer layer of the cerebellum has this ridge-like quality or ridge surface. And again, we just want to make sure that as we add in detailing to the cerebellum or the encasing, outer encasing of the cerebellum, we want to work in these ridges to just emphasize that muscular texture a little better. As we continue with our drawing and start working into the features near the back of the brain, we can actually start using pen work at this point. Now, a really good suggestion is to use something or a variety of tools, maybe like a micron pen where you can work with more refined lines, and some ballpoint pen where you can actually use the pen similar to a pencil and kind of shade with the pen. Just to give the drawing a little bit more contrast and bring out some features. So for instance, a really good idea to create distinctions between features is you can darken some features and lighten some features. So with the cerebral aqueducts, that branch-like structure, what you can do is you could actually shade around it, and what that's going to do is it's going to bring a little bit more emphasis or distinction between that feature and the surrounding features. What they'll also do is, again, bring a little bit more emphasis to that muscular ridge-like outer layer of the cerebellum that encases the cerebral aqueducts or that branch-like structure. So this is a process that will take some time. Again, we want to use our pencil sketch to really assist us as we proceed with our pen drawing process. But we slowly want to work through the entire brain from one side to the other. And this is just going to be the most effective way to go about this without making any mistakes. When we use pen, obviously pen is quite susceptible to making mistakes. So a good idea is also to keep some scrap paper nearby to scribble on, and this way we can get rid of any excess ink that builds up in the pen as we continue with the pen shading process. Now, as we continue with this process of shading the drawing and the various features with pen, two things to remember. For one, we want to treat ballpoint pen as we do a pencil. That means we want to be conscious of the pressure we apply to the pen, and we can kind of use it in the same way to create gradients, these gradients that go from dark to light. Ballpoint pen ink tends to come out more sparingly, which means it doesn't leave these very dark, vivid marks. So we can actually build up layers of shading to establish shadowing and structure in the various textures present in the different features of the brain. Another thing we want to consider is working from one area of the brain and then slowly going through the other area, or breaking up these components into different sections. And this is going to make the process a little bit more digestible and allows us to focus on one component at a time. Now, we're simply going to work our way through to the central features of the brain, and this is where we can focus some shading attention to features such as the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and all those little smaller details where we also want to make sure we can emphasize their structure with more refined line work. So take your time really working on one structure at a time and slowly kind of finishing up those smaller details before moving on to the outer encasing, such as the lobes. Again, shading is a means for us to not only define structures, but also create distinctions between various features. So the intention with shading is, as we focus on each little structure and create more refined outlines of the actual feature, we are both creating a distinction between all the components amidst one another, but then we are also giving each of these components a little bit more three-dimensionality and making the drawing a little bit more interesting, So the idea here is to really work through these central features first, making sure we're starting or focusing on one set of features before we start moving towards the lobes and the outer exterior features of the brain. And this is where we can start paying attention to the features such as the pituitary glands, as well as the lamina terminalis, or areas such as the corpus callosum, as well as the fornix, the septal region. We really want to obviously think about the fact that these are organic structures and they have subtle curvatures in them. So we really want to take our time utilizing shading to establish curvature, bulging, indentation, and really creating a more three-dimensional form within each of these components. Now, at this point in the tutorial, we have already obviously established the sketch of the brain, and we are using our pencil sketch to assist us as we add pen work into these features. As we continue with this process and shade in every single feature, it will take some time, but slowly as we come to the completion of these features and start to see how they pair together with a little bit more refined line work and shading, we'll start to see that this brain drawing starts to pop and become a little bit more of a realistic cross-section of a brain, as opposed to a two-dimensional diagram or diagrammatical representation of a brain. Now, once we have completed these central components and spent a good portion of time, we can start moving towards the lobe structures of the brain. And this is where we're going to start shifting from, or moving and starting from, the back end features, where we shift from the occipital lobe, moving along to the parietal lobe, the limbic lobe, and eventually the frontal lobe. What we're going to do is, again, we really want to consider the fact that this is a tubular, kind of muscular texture. And this particular encasing of the brain, these lobes, kind of fold in on themselves, very similar to organs, almost as if they like compactly closely put together and encasing the entire brain itself. And the way in which we kind of define this is along the line work that kind of defines this tubular structure. What we're going to do is we're going to shade along the line. So we're not necessarily going to shade in the entire surface area of the lobes, but what we're going to do is we're going to slowly work along the lines and shade over the lines and create these small gradients from the lines that run through the lobes or define the structure of the lobes. And what this is going to do is it's going to create this, again, distinction between lighter and darker moments within these particular features of the brain, which is slowly going to establish this folding tubular organ-like texture that kind of has curvature along its surface area. So the intention here is to slowly take your time working along the lines that define the curvatures of these organ-like structures in the lobes, and kind of shade along the lines. So as you shade along the lines, we can actually outline the lines and darken them, but then we also want to create little gradients that kind of develop from those lines and shift into the more open, larger surface areas within the various lobes. Again, we don't want to color in the lobes completely. We do want to make sure that these gradients kind of shift to or get lighter and kind of come to a negative space where we can actually leave some negative space within the various lobes. So this is the intention, and this is the process that we're gonna take with us into the shading part of the lobes, and we're slowly gonna take our time working from one side of the lobe, maybe starting by the back end, the occipital lobe, and slowly working your way through the entire lobe structure around the brain. Now we are at this point in the tutorial where we kind of have already defined the entire brain drawing, not only by pencil sketch, but by refined line work, some shading. We've gone through the various features. We've kind of discussed how to utilize a variety of different drawing processes in order to not only emphasize and enhance the variety of features within the brain, but also how these drawing techniques, such as shading and line work, can also create a distinction between the various features in the brain, so the drawing doesn't look too flat or too diagrammatical, but also looks like an actual cross-section of a real brain. As we come to the lobes, we'll find that this will take some time, but this is simply the process from here on out. It's more about just going over all the features and taking your time, making sure that you're slowly building up layers of shading. Again, ballpoint pen is very similar to pencil, so you don't necessarily want to rush the process of shading, but you can treat the shading process the same as you would with a pencil. This means we just want to pay attention to building up layers of shading, as well as making sure we are conscious of the pressure that we apply to the pen, and also making sure that we have some scrap paper nearby dry to get rid of any excess buildup of ink in the pen itself. So yeah, that's it, guys. This is the basic process of how to draw a brain. The main takeaways for this particular type of brain drawing is that, for one, you really want to make sure you have a diagram. It's really important that we understand how the different components actually fit together. We also want to understand how large the different components are, and understanding that will enable us to have a more accurate approach when we place these features together. From there, it's a matter of refining the features, making sure that we are actually capturing their form and shape correctly once we have placed them in their correct spaces. And then from there, it's just about enhancing these features with shading, line work, and a little bit more detailed drawing. Otherwise, that's it from my side, guys. I hope this tutorial was helpful. Again, there are many ways to draw a brain, but in this particular tutorial, the intention was to really understand how the brain is put together, providing us with a better understanding of the anatomical nature of these various features and how they are placed together to form the larger and holistic visual representation of a brain. Take your time with the drawing process. Make sure that you don't rush when you feel tired. Make sure to take breaks. It's a very underestimated part of the drawing process. Drawing can be quite strenuous, so remember to take a break and then come back to the drawing with a more fresh approach. Otherwise, that's it from my side, guys. If you did like the video, please like and subscribe. And until next time, see you in the next video. Cheers.